The Neoliberal Podcast is part of the Neoliberal Project and made possible by our members and supporters. If you enjoy the podcast and want to become a member of the project, head to neoliberalproject.org/join. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. These members and patrons help cover the podcast's expenses and make it all happen. Thanks for your support, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and this week's episode is a books episode. We're recapping the best books of 2022, as read by your host, myself. If you're not familiar with this episode, we do this about twice a year, where we simply recap many of the books that have been featured on this podcast, some books that have not been featured on the podcast. We review books that include everything from fiction to nonfiction, and I just try to give some of my takes on the best books that I've read in this year. It's 2022, we're 6 months into the year, we're halfway through, and so it's time to get this done. So without any further ado, we will get it started. As I mentioned before, we will be reviewing both fiction and nonfiction. The nonfiction tends to be academic in nature, and it can be biographies of different people. It can be subjects like zoning, housing, immigration, things like that we care about a lot. They can be topics that we don't care about a lot. The fiction work tends towards science fiction and fantasy, just because it's what I tend to enjoy. But lots of things do get thrown in there, as you'll see. We'll kick off this episode with two books that I did not particularly enjoy. They're the only two books in this episode that I'm going to recommend against. Most of the books that I read I end up enjoying, and I don't have much of a problem with. And I mostly enjoy what I read. I feel like I do a good job selecting books to read. But every once in a while, you get a book that you think will be really good, and it just ends up disappointing you. It's an inevitable part of life. And so we'll kick off the episode with two books that disappointed me after reading, that I was enthusiastic about and did not enjoy in the end. The first book that we will mention in the episode is The Chancellor by Katie Martin. The Chancellor is subtitled The Remarkable Odyssey of Angela Merkel, and it is essentially a biography of Angela Merkel. Now, the book was interesting in many ways. The book, I learned things from this book. I learned new facts about Angela Merkel, about the way she governs, about her early life. From that perspective, I don't think the book was a failure. But there's a particular line that you often have to draw when you are doing a biography, especially a biography of a living person. It can be very easy to simply become a cheerleader for that person, especially when the person you are doing a biography of is a political actor and has every incentive to kind of portray their actions in the best light. In this book, I don't think that the author, Katie Martin, got direct interviews with Angela Merkel, but she certainly had interviews with many, many people in her inner circle. And there's just always this struggle with a book. How do you write an accurate, factual book about someone that treats them fairly when you have to get sources that are often going to be biased in one direction or another? Sometimes books turn into hit jobs. This book is a biography of someone. I don't like them. I interview all the people who dislike them, and the book is, harshly negative towards that person, perhaps unfairly. Sometimes it's the opposite. You interview a bunch of people who are very loyal. They're insiders. They are part of this person's inner circle, and it turns into just an uncritical cheerleading exercise. And unfortunately, I think that The Chancellor turns into this. As I said, it's not an entirely awful book. It does have a lot of interesting factual information. I learned a lot of things about how Merkel grew up, how she sees the world. I think it's interesting from that perspective of, if you are a Merkel loyalist, what is the story about Angela Merkel? But I do think that the book simply falls into cheerleading. It's a little bit too uncritical of some of her mistakes. These particularly fall very harshly in the current light. Her dealings with Putin in the current light of the Ukraine crisis and Russia's invasion of Ukraine seem to be a lot worse than they did when this book came out in mid-2021, and when it was being written probably across 2020 and 2021. It's just kind of waved away as, well, Angela Merkel was doing the smart, tough thing with Putin, when it no longer looks like that is the case. That part of the book did not age well. In general, it's simply too cheerleading of all of her good moments and too dismissive of her bad moments that, it kind of waves away. An interesting book, but ultimately a book that I would not recommend for an unbiased read. That is The Chancellor by Katie Martin, about the life of Angela Merkel. The second book that I would not recommend, and that disappointed me quite a lot, is Wonderworks by Angus Fletcher. This book has been released with actually multiple subtitles, as far as I can tell. It is sometimes subtitled Wonderworks, the 25 most powerful inventions in the history of literature. Sometimes it's subtitled Wonderworks, literary invention and the science of stories. And it has this beautiful cover where there's lines between different famous authors, between Shakespeare and Jane Austen and Edgar Allan Poe. And, you can go back to some of the Greek authors like Homer, whoever Homer was, if that was a real person, all the way up to the modern day with like Tina Fey being listed. Kafka is in there. And what I had anticipated this book to be, from the cover and from the description on the back and from the phrasing, literary invention, the science of stories, I thought this was going to be a book about the history of literary technique. Who was the first person to use the omniscient third-person technique, and when did first-person narrative really develop? What was the first modern version of what we would call a romantic comedy? When did the tragicomedies become ascendant? How did we develop these different techniques for storytelling? I thought it would be like a history of techniques in storytelling and how they developed and how they influenced culture. And it is that just a little bit. But mostly it's a book about weird woo neuroscience, which is very much unexpected in terms of it's not advertised that way. I felt deceptively advertised to when I got this book. They will spend a few pages each chapter talking about, okay, here's when we invented this thing called the epic, and the epics invented in Greece, and, Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey and blah, 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 all this stuff. And they'll do that very, very quickly and then transition into something like, this is also related to this particular chemical in your brain. And when your brain is flooded with this chemical, that's what the ancient Greeks would have called courage. And really, you can see how the neuroscience is related to the Odyssey. And the whole thing just feels very bizarre, very, very weird. I feel like the science really doesn't hold up. Sure, they're probably giving a factual description of what happens with certain chemicals in your brain or something, but how does that relate to this metaphysical concept we call courage? They think it does. How does that relate to the epic poem? I don't know, but the whole thing is very poorly written to me. I read a couple chapters of this and honestly had to put it down. I think the neuroscience angle of how science is, how the neuroscience of our brain is related to storytelling, it doesn't work at all. They don't actually tell a compelling story. It sounds more like woo to me. It sounds like Joe Rogan science or Gwyneth Paltrow science, or just one of these people who are selling you some story that doesn't actually fit. It's also just not very well written, which is a shame because, as best I can tell, the author is a professor of English. So you'd expect at least the quality of the prose would be good, even if I don't like what he's saying, the quality of the writing would be good. But it's not all that good. So ultimately, I put this down after just a couple chapters and am not going to finish it. Cannot recommend it, but the book is Wonderworks by Angus Fletcher. So those were the two books that I would not recommend this year. Luckily, it's only two. I usually just don't read very many books that I would say are bad and that I genuinely regret reading them. And so there's only a couple this year. We're now going to get into some books that I would generally recommend. The general rating system that we're going to use here is derived from Roger Ebert, the famous movie critic. It's a pretty simple system. You can go thumbs up or thumbs down. And you can go 1 thumbs up or 2 thumbs up. You can go 1 thumbs down or 2 thumbs down. Very simple. 4 different ratings. You don't need more than 4. Tell us what you thought. Did you like it? And did you really like it? Or did you love it? So without any further ado, we will get into some of the books that I read this year that I would recommend. The first book that we'll mention that I would recommend this year is the book Fixer Upper by Jenny Schuetz. Jenny Schuetz is a fellow at the Brookings Institute who studies housing and the housing systems that we have in America. And Fixer Upper is subtitled How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems. This is both a descriptive book of what is wrong with America's housing systems and a policy book recommending specific actions to be taken to fix those issues. Jenny Schuetz talks about how housing sits at the intersection of a bunch of complex systems. Housing is not something that exists on its own. Housing intersects with transit policy. It intersects with poverty policy. It intersects with our job markets, with our physical geography and the land. Everything is impacted by housing and everything is interconnected with housing. And she believes that we're simply not building enough housing, and that where we are building it, we're building the wrong kind of housing, and we're building it in the wrong places. The book goes on in this manner, and obviously this is something that I'm very receptive to, an argument that we need to build more housing, we need to build more higher quality housing in the right places. That's directly up our alley. It's probably directly up your alley as well, if you care about these things. Fixer Upper was a high-quality book about the housing market. There will be an interesting comparison later on with another book about the housing market, called Arbitrary Lines, but we'll get there when we get there. For now, I will just say this is a good book. If you're interested in housing policy in America, I would recommend it. 1 thumbs up to Jenny Schuetz, Fixer Upper. The next book we'll tackle is Strength in Numbers by G. Eliot Morris. Strength in Numbers is subtitled How Polls Work and Why We Need Them. I should note that we did a podcast very recently with Eliot Morris about this book and about the science of polling, the history of polling, and election modeling. I should also note we did a podcast with Jenny Schuetz when her book Fixer Upper came out, about the book Fixer Upper. Many of these books we will have done podcasts on. All of those links will be in the description. Strength in Numbers is a very interesting book. It had a great deal more history than I was expecting. I was expecting it to be a more technical look at the polling industry, at the election modeling industry, and how it gets things right and gets things wrong. And it does do that, but it also has a pretty good deal of history and kind of the narrative of how polling developed over time, from some of the very beginning, very early origins of polling, before it was a scientific field in the slightest. It also includes a decent amount of philosophy about why do we need polling at all? You know, there's this basic question of polling lets us know what the public thinks, but why do we care what the public thinks? There's actually kind of important philosophical conversations to be had about that topic that this book covers. Not in an extraordinary amount of depth, but in a reasonably deep level, and that was a pleasant surprise to me. I would recommend this book. I think it covers polling from a number of angles. As I said, it covers the philosophical justifications for why is it important to know what the public thinks. It covers the history of polling, from musters to straw polls to the very early attempts to do scientific polling to the current day. It covers the current issues with polling. Why are we seeing polls that can be biased in one direction? What is non-response bias? It covers election modeling, the people who try to aggregate polls and produce predictions about an election's outcome in a statistical sense. And it covers what should be done, what fixes need to happen in the polling industry. This is a common feature of many of these kind of books about a particular academic subject that impact policy in some way. You'll spend the first, say, 8 chapters of your book describing something, and then the final chapter, the 9th chapter, is a set of recommendations, basically. It's a very common way to structure a book, and this one is no different. But in general, a fairly high-quality book. Would recommend. Strength in Numbers by G. Eliot Morris. Will give it 1 thumbs up. The next book that we will mention is Broken by Janine Lawson. This book is not about an academic subject, the way many of the ones before have been. This is a comedy book. Janine Lawson is a comedy writer. I have previously read 2 of Janine Lawson's other books and absolutely loved them. Some of her previous books include Let's Pretend This Never Happened and Furiously Happy. And these books are incredibly funny to me. Like, sitting on the couch, cackling out loud, reading some of this, laughing so hard I have to put the book down to wipe tears away from my eyes. Those 2 books I highly, highly recommend. Furiously Happy and Let's Pretend This Never Happened. The chapters in each book are generally about an episode from her life. The comedy is typically about something that happened to her. Janine Lawson is a comedic writer. She suffers from different mental illnesses, depression, and a few other things, but she's very, very good at taking her kind of travails and her sadness and just the bizarre things that happen to her as a result of these things and turning them into really, really high comedy. And these books have been pretty successful. The 3rd book, Broken, is along the same lines. I found this one to be good, but not quite as incredibly, ridiculously funny as the other 2. Perhaps it's just that I'm reading the 3rd book of this kind, but by the 3rd book, I've gotten used to it, and it's no longer as fresh and new. Maybe it's just that I've kind of gotten used to the sense of humor, because it is still a funny book. There's a lot of funny moments in Broken, but I didn't find it quite as good as the other ones, which I absolutely loved. If you like comedy writing, if you like reading about somebody whose own life is kind of messed up, but they present it to you in a comedic way such that it's really funny how messed up their life is, and they get a lot of humor out of it, then this would be a good book for you to read. I would recommend that you start with her other books, though. Furiously Happy is a great book to start with. So that's the recommendation. 1 thumb up for Broken. Furiously Happy and Let's Pretend This Never Happened are pretty close to 2 thumbs up. So potentially start there if you're looking for some comedy writing with Janine Lawson. We've been talking about a number of nonfiction books. These are mostly academic books, but they're all written about the real world. It's time to take an interlude to talk about some fiction, because I also read fiction, and I think it's good to balance your literary diet between works of fiction and works of nonfiction. They're both valuable in their own way. And so let's talk about some of the fiction that I've read this year. Then, after that, we'll get back to some of the nonfiction works. And at the end of the episode, the top 4 books that I've read this year, of any type. The first work of fiction that we will mention is Emma by Jane Austen. I read Emma because I thought, there's so many classic works of literature that I simply haven't read, and frankly, I don't know if I will ever read all of them. There's so many works by George Eliot and Charles Dickens and Jane Austen and Shakespeare, and just there's so much out there. you could fill a lifetime reading all of the classic literature in the world, to say nothing of authors that are not from an English-speaking country, non-American or non-English authors. But I thought, I read so much science fiction, modern science fiction. I read so much nonfiction academic books. I should devote at least a little bit of time every year to the classics. And so I thought, let's pick up one of the classics. So somewhat randomly, I selected Emma by Jane Austen. And I really enjoyed Emma. I will say it was helpful to me to have watched a movie version of Emma before I read it, because the writing style is a little bit difficult. I think it's a well-written book, but it is a well-written book with quality prose meant for an audience in the 1800s. It was published in 1815, and simply the language and the way that people wrote back then was very different. The social conventions and the kind of implied meanings of certain phrases were very different, and so you do have to read it a bit carefully. There's just things that go unsaid in the text that you're supposed to pick up on because you know the social conventions and you know the average reaction that someone would have in England in 1815. I do not live in England in 1815, as you might guess. And so sometimes you have to just examine more critically, like, what does Jane Austen want me to pick up out of this scene? When this guy makes this remark, I'm supposed to understand that as being very rude, or I'm supposed to understand that as actually being incredibly generous, more generous than a person of his station should be. But regardless of the fact that it's a little bit of a difficult read due to the 200-year gap, I still found it entertaining and funny in points, and generally a sharp book, and I'm glad that I read. Emma is about a young woman who is a fairly upper crust woman in England. She's not like a princess, but she's of the landed gentry. She does not have to work. Her family does not have to work. She envisions herself as a matchmaker and ends up getting herself into trouble through her efforts at matchmaking and romantic games among the people that she knows. It's what I would call a comedy of manners. This is one of the great forms of English novel, is the comedy of manners, where you have social situations and someone has acted inappropriately, and the real drama is about whether the social situation will work out in favor of our heroine or our hero. Jane Austen is a real specialist at the comedy of manners, where you are supposed to find humor in the social interactions among people. And there's also some drama as well. You are wondering, will a favorable marriage be made? Will the two people who secretly love each other realize that they love each other? Will the social conflict explode? Will this person be disgraced? There's some drama as well, but mostly I would say it is a comedic retelling of the social stations and the social practices of these people. I really enjoyed it. I plan to read additional Jane Austen at some point later in the year. I would recommend this. If you don't read classics very often, I think doing it once or twice a year is a worthwhile thing. So I enjoyed this. One thumb up for Emma by Jane Austen. Now, Emma is very different from the rest of the fiction that I read this year, which is mostly science fiction and fantasy, as per usual. The first two books I'm going to talk about in the science fiction that I read this year come from the same series. They are Record of a Spaceborne Few and The Galaxy and the Ground Within. Both of these books are by Becky Chambers. They are books in the Wayfarer series. Previous books I believe we have reviewed on this podcast before are The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet and A Closed and Common Orbit. All four of those books are set in a common setting. There's a galactic civilization that is composed of many different races of beings. There are humans. There are also different kinds of aliens, some of which are much more bizarre than others. And the interesting thing about the series is that the books are only loosely interconnected. they're set in the same galaxy with the same races of people and the same planets and the same locations, but the characters only overlap slightly. The first book is mostly about a ship that is designed to open up holes in space-time that ships can travel through. They are the wormhole creators. They create these interstellar tunnels that people can use for fast travel. And then the second book really only follows one crew member who has left that ship and goes on their own adventure. The third book follows something entirely different. The third book is about a group called the Exodus Fleet, which is mentioned only in passing in the previous books of the series. They are essentially the humans that initially left Earth and lived in a self-contained kind of spaceship society. It's actually a much better version, I think, of the Kim Stanley Robinson version of everybody just does communism and gets along. Kim Stanley Robinson did this in The Ministry for the Future, where society solves climate change by just universally adopting rural agricultural communism and agreeing to not have nice things anymore, which is a super realistic way of describing the world. This one actually makes a lot more sense to me because these are refugees that are fleeing the Earth, basically. They live in a society that is maybe a few tens of thousands of people, not billions. And on the scale of, one giant spaceship with 20,000 people on it, you could actually see how a kind of everybody just chips in kind of squishy socialism, that might actually make sense. That could actually work within a very small enclosed society like that. And the resources are literally recycled. They have a system for recycling all the waste and the matter and growing new food and blah, blah, blah. All of that kind of stuff. You could see how this kind of thing is interesting and more plausible within a self-contained spaceship society. They don't live on a planet. They all just live on this self-contained spaceship, and they govern themselves in this very unusual way. It's an interesting book, and I thought it was a better version of books that I've read before, like Ministry for the Future. Interestingly enough, though, one of the big problems that they do face as this sort of communitarian society is that the children are becoming more aware that if they leave the society, they could go get rich on another planet. And so the children are all leaving. They're experiencing brain drain. That's a problem that is addressed in the book. But I think it's a realistic way for this to function. And again, they talk about how everybody has to do waste duty that nobody likes to do, but everybody's required to do it. And again, a realistic way in which this would function. So a good book in the series. The fourth book in the series is called The Galaxy and the Ground Within. Again, this only is marginally related to the previous characters. It's simply set in the same universe. This one takes place at an interstellar rest stop where ships come to refuel and chart their new navigational chart. And something has happened. A battle is taking place. That the pathways are no longer safe. And so people are simply stuck at this rest stop for a while. A bunch of travelers who didn't intend to meet each other. Drama ensues. Again, a pretty good book. Both from the same series. I would recommend these. You'll probably want to start, if you read these books, with the one at the beginning, which is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. But I'm a big fan of this series in general. It's by Becky Chambers. The two books are Record of a Spaceborne Few and The Galaxy and the Ground Within. The next book we will talk about is A Practical Guide to Conquering the World. This is another book in a series that I have previously mentioned. This is called the Siege series. The first book is 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City by K.J. Parker. The second book in the series is How to Rule an Empire and Get Away with It by K.J. Parker. And the third book is, as I mentioned, A Practical Guide to Conquering the World by K.J. Parker. This one I would only half-heartedly recommend. The initial book, 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City, is an incredible book in my opinion. All of these books feature a protagonist who is basically thrust into leadership unexpectedly. They don't really want to be a leader. They never planned to be a leader, but circumstance has thrust them into this position. 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City is about how an engineer is forced to take leadership of an entire city during a siege. It's kind of a medieval fantasy structure. There's a walled city that they live in, and there's a giant army besieging them. And they do not have a giant army within the city. They have just a small city guard, some citizens who maybe a couple of them know how to fire a bow and arrow, and that's about it. 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City is great because it covers very practical things. It's a very interesting example of what I would call hard fantasy, where it's not focused on magical elves and orcs and, enchanted swords. This one is more focused on, well, it's a siege, so how do we get clean water? We have to fight them off using bows and arrows. How do we manufacture 20,000 arrows in the next week? How do we get people to do that? How do we build our fortifications? If they come and attack the gate, how do we successfully reinforce it? It's literally logistical and engineering feats, is the story of the original book. I'm reminded of the phrase, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics, when talking about military matters. And so 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City is very refreshing. The second book was also good, but it got more into politics, how to rule an empire and get away with it. The third book gets more into grand politics and geopolitics of this world and conquering things, I guess. It's a different protagonist for every book. I feel like the series over time has lost a little bit of that quality that made it so special, where it was very hard fantasy, focused on very concrete, practical engineering and logistical challenges, and slowly became more like just a regular fantasy. And it's not bad. A Practical Guide to Conquering the World is not bad, but it just has lost something that made the first book very special. So this one I would give 1 thumbs up, but probably a weak thumbs up. I would heavily recommend the first book in this series, but perhaps not as much the most recent one. That's A Practical Guide to Conquering the World by K.J. Parker. The next fiction work that we have to discuss is Cloud Cuckoo Land. This is a novel by Anthony Doerr, came out in 2021, and I really, really enjoyed this. Cloud Cuckoo Land is the story of 3 different timelines. There's a timeline that the story follows in 15th century Byzantium, Constantinople, I guess, where there are characters in Constantinople who are being besieged, and we also see characters who are from the outside doing the sieging. There's also a storyline set in the modern day about a Korean War veteran named Zeno who works in a library in Idaho. And there is a storyline about Constance, who is a young girl aboard a spaceship that is set in the 22nd century. Now, it's very difficult to describe exactly what is happening in all of these stories without giving away some crucial plot points. But I don't think it's too much to say all 3 plots end up being very intertwined in ways that you don't expect. The 15th century Constantinople plot, the modern day Idaho plot, and the spaceship plot centuries in the future, all of these characters are actually intertwined in mysterious ways. And they are all connected by an interest in a story by Aristophanes, the ancient Greek writer, called The Birds. The Birds is something that Aristophanes wrote, and it's about a man who wishes to turn into a bird so he can visit Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is a magical kingdom in the clouds built by birds and cuckoos, where birds can live free from any of the stresses of life on the ground, I guess. And he goes through these trials and tribulations in order to get to Cloud Cuckoo Land disguised as a bird. All of the characters in the book have some link to this. They're either fascinated by the story, or they discover the story, or something has brought them to this story. the quality of the prose and the writing is really, really strong. I really enjoyed reading it. It's a fast, easy read. The tension, the dramatic tension is very high. I kind of wish I could tell you more about it, how these stories develop, but I feel like I can't do that without giving away some of the plot points. So what I will just say is that I strongly enjoyed it and I would recommend it. This is Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. 1 thumbs up, definitely would recommend. The final science fiction book and the final work of fiction that we'll be talking about this episode is Kaiju Preservation Society. The Kaiju Preservation Society is a book by John Scalzi. This book is exactly what it says on the cover. It's a book about kaiju and the people who want to preserve them. If you're not familiar with the term, kaiju essentially means like a giant Godzilla-esque creature. This could mean Godzilla itself is a kaiju. It's a giant, 500-foot-tall monster that is powered by nuclear energy inside of it and can breathe out nuclear fire and things like that. But also, all of the things that in Godzilla movies that Godzilla fights, like Mothra, the giant moth, or like the giant crabs or the giant worms, or anything like that, those are all kaiju as well. Those would all be classified as kaiju. In this book, kaiju are actually real. This book asks the question, what if kaiju actually existed and it was just a secret? And what if there was an Illuminati-like secret society that was dedicated to actually preserving these creatures, not to destroying them, but to helping them thrive in their own natural environments so that they don't bother us and we don't bother them? That's what it is. It's a book about that, and you can obviously tell it's a book about giant monsters. Something's going to go wrong at some point, but I think it was a very fun read. This is a light read. It's something you can breeze through in a day or two. It is definitely not heavy philosophical content. It's a book that says, wouldn't it be cool if giant monsters existed? And, I enjoyed it. Sometimes you need a light read. This book is exactly as advertised. So I would recommend it if you enjoy Godzilla movies or the kaiju theme. Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi. So that's the end of our little bit of interlude with some of the works of fiction that I've read this year. We will now get back to the more regular diet of nonfiction and academic works that make up most of what I read. We've got 3 more that I would call our regular recommendations, and then we will get to the top 4 books that I've read this year of any type, fiction or nonfiction. The next 3 books are what I would call the honorable mentions. These are not books that I would put in the top 4 of my books this year, but they are books that I enjoyed quite a lot, that I gave some consideration to putting in the top 4. The first one that I will mention is Why We Fight by Chris Blattman. The subtitle of this book is The Roots of War and the Paths to Peace. And this is a book about why conflict happens. Not any specific conflict. Why does conflict, and military conflict in particular, sustained long-term violence or outbreaks of war? Why does this happen? I really like this book because it starts by contradicting itself immediately in a way that I actually find very intellectually honest and open. It's a book about war and conflict, but it starts out by noting that, look, actually we don't fight most of the time. Most of the time when 2 societies live next to each other, they are not in a state of war. When 2 countries exist next to each other, they might bicker, but most of the time it does not erupt into long-term sustained violence. Even most gangs or something like that live next to each other, the 2 gangs in the same city, most of the time they are not actively trying to kill each other. Gang violence and gang warfare can erupt, but it is actually a break from the norm. The norm is that we find ways not to fight. And one of Chris Blattman's points in this book is that fighting is really, really costly. Even if you stand to gain something from a war, war is just very, very costly. So you have to have some very strong reason to ignore the cost of fighting in order to do it. And he talks about what those reasons are. And they are not moral reasons. This is not a book of morality. This is not a book of specific geopolitical circumstances. This is a book that tries to categorize the base level foundations for why we fight, almost in a game theoretic or economic sense. So he talks about, why do we ever break this norm? If the norm is peace, and if fighting is really, really costly to both sides, why does it ever happen? He talks about different factors that can do this. Intangible incentives, for instance, where if you believe that this city is a holy city and regardless of the cost, you must take this city or else you will be doomed to hell forever, that's something that can't be negotiated away, right? He talks about unchecked interests, where leadership does not necessarily match the incentives that the general country has. Perhaps your country will suffer, but you as a leader will benefit. He talks about uncertainty, where you're more likely to enter into a conflict if you can't be sure what another party is going to do. He talks about misperceptions of another party's ability. Maybe you think this country is very weak when in fact they are very strong. He talks about commitment problems. These are all kind of the base level ideas that can be applied to any situation, really. Any conflict that is broken out almost certainly involves one of these ideas, a misperception or an unchecked interest. You could use an example of, say, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and many of these factors are at play. You have unchecked interests in the form of Vladimir Putin is not really accountable to the Russian people in a way that he would be in a democracy. So if he simply wants to invade, or if it benefits him to invade, maybe they will just invade despite the fact that this is so costly. You could also talk about intangible incentives, one of the things that Blattman lists, where Putin is said to be obsessed with restoring Russia's honor and correcting the mistake that was the breakup of the USSR. And this is kind of a thing that he values so highly that you almost can't buy him off. Even if Ukraine wanted to negotiate, it would be very difficult for them to do so because this is simply an intangible idea that he won't compromise on. You can also talk about misperceptions. The Russian idea of Ukraine was that they would roll over and die within a few days of the invasion. They had no idea that Ukrainian resistance would be so stiff, and they badly misjudged and misperceived the strength of Ukrainian will. And so you could kind of apply these lessons to any conflict. And I think he actually does a very good job of really getting what are the base level things that make negotiated settlements impossible and war likely. These 5 reasons, I think, do a very good job of describing those things. Part 2 of the book is called The Paths to Peace and talks about some of the factors that can reduce these reasons for war. If there are certain situations and certain alignments that lead to war and lead to conflict, how can we reduce them? And he talks about things like checks and balances in ruling societies. He talks about interdependence, that when countries are more dependent on each other, they are less likely to fight. He talks about interventions and the history there, whether or not they make sense or not. He talks about having logical rules and enforcing them regularly. The rule of law matters. In general, I find this to be a really, really helpful book and a really solid contribution to the way I think about conflict. It's changed the way I view some conflicts. And we did get a chance to interview Chris Blattman. Very fascinating guy, very fascinating interview. I would strongly recommend this book to anyone who is trying to understand conflict on a broad level. The book is Why We Fight by Chris Blattman. Definitely a recommend. The second book in our honorable mentions is Streets of Gold by Leah Bustan and Ron Abramitsky. Once again, we did a podcast with Leah and Ron. We'll link that in the show notes, as we will with every other podcast that we did that's relevant to this episode. This book is about the history of immigration in America, and specifically how those immigrants relate to today's immigrants. There's a storyline that you sometimes hear about immigration in America, where people are concerned about today's immigrants and whether or not they will integrate, and whether or not it's too much, or whether or not they really want to be Americans. Will they speak English? Will they do this? Will they do that? They will have these concerns while at the same time saying, look, immigration in the past was great. Either those people were like us, or those people were willing to adapt, those people were willing to assimilate, those people were willing to get jobs. And so we don't think immigration in the past was a bad idea, but we're concerned about immigration today. Bustan and Abramitsky take that concept, that idea, very seriously, and they try to measure it. They try to measure by objective standards, are immigrants today similar to immigrants in the past? Are they assimilating at the same rate as immigrants in the past? And what they find is generally that yes, immigrants today are actually very similar to immigrants in the past. They have some creative ways to do this. They measure assimilation through means like how you name your children. You can name your children a very ethnic-sounding name or a very American-sounding name, and it turns out that when you first move here, immigrants tend to give very ethnic names to their children. Once you've lived here for a long time, though, say you've lived in America for 15 years and you have your fourth child, that child tends to be named much more like a regular American baby from a American who was born here, a natively born American, so to speak. That happened in the past at a certain rate. There was a certain rate at which the foreignness of a name of an immigrant child would go down as they lived here for a longer and longer period of time. And that rate of change is the same thing today. We see the exact same pattern happening at the exact same speed in today's immigrants. Today's immigrants, when they move here, if they have a child right away, it's likely to have a foreign-sounding name. If they have a child 10, 15 years after they move to America, it's more likely to have an American-sounding name, and it's the exact same pattern as it was in the past. They do other things, but looking at income, looking at the concentration of whether the person lives in an immigrant neighborhood or in a more diverse neighborhood that is not just immigrants. They look at intermarriage. Does the person marry another immigrant, or does the person marry an American? They look at, does the person speak English or not? And what they find is that generally the patterns of immigrants from 100, 150 years ago are very, very similar to the patterns of immigrants today. Immigrants, by and large, do assimilate, and they assimilate today at basically the same rate that they assimilated in the past. They also talk about why immigrant children tend to be so successful, because one of the interesting features of immigration in America is that even if an immigrant is poor, let's say an immigrant moves here to America and is at the 25th percentile of income, that immigrant's children, who is at the 25th percentile of income, will do better than an American's child if that American is living at the 25th percentile of income. These are children who both grew up at the 25th percentile of income, but the immigrant child will demonstrably do better. And this is true for almost every category of immigrant. If you list out 50 types of immigrants from England, Russia, Spain, Scandinavia, China, India, Brazil, Nigeria, you can list out all these countries. I think out of like 50 countries, 48 of the immigrant countries exceeded the average American when controlling for the percentile they were born at. So overall, a very interesting book. I think, it's tough for me because I read so many books on immigration to learn anything new. I've heard the argument for why immigration is good a dozen times in these books, but this was something new, specifically the comparison between past immigrants' assimilation and current immigrants' assimilation. It's very useful to know that. I really enjoyed this book, and if you're interested in the history of immigration, I think you would enjoy it too. The book is Streets of Gold by Leah Bustan and Ron Abramitsky. Our final honorable mention, and the final book before we get to the top 4 books of 2022, at least the first half of 2022, our final honorable mention is Arbitrary Lines by M. Nolan Gray. The subtitle here is Arbitrary Lines: How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. Now, this book is a diatribe in some levels against zoning and against our system of zoning. So of course I loved it. And of course you're probably going to love it too. Nolan Gray is a city planner with a lot of expertise and experience working through New York's municipal zoning code. And there are several things about this book that I think distinguish it as a particularly useful book about zoning and about housing policy in general. It has a really great discussion of the history of zoning. How was land used before zoning? Zoning didn't exist for most of human history, so how the hell did we decide where to build things? It turns out it was mostly common sense, and it wasn't entirely unregulated without zoning. There were still things you could do to ensure that, there wouldn't be a leather tannery, which is a notoriously smelly and toxic and awful thing to live next to. There wouldn't be a leather tannery next to a bunch of residential homes or a children's elementary school. There were ways that they got around that without having zoning. It introduces the history of how zoning was initially conceived, which is very, very interesting. He talks about what he calls a Baptists and bootleggers match between the people who thought you could kind of scientifically zone the world because this is high modernism. We know how to plan everything. We can rationally plan society. And so we're just going to zone everything in the proper way, like a good engineer would. And those people were supported by people who wanted to simply use it for their own selfish ends, whether to increase their own property value or to keep out a certain undesirable race, to keep black people out of their part of town, or to keep Jewish people out of their streets. This is the Baptists and bootleggers phenomenon, where one person supports the policy for a very ideological reason. The Baptist supports prohibition because he believes in it. He believes alcohol is evil. The bootlegger supports prohibition because he's selfish and he wants to keep selling his illegal alcohol at a 5 times markup. Zoning's history has something like that. It has the very ideological high modernists who simply believe it's good to rationally plan a city, and it has the very selfish people who simply want to keep undesirables out of their part of town and protect their own property value. The book has a lot of interesting history. It also has a lot of simply very interesting detail where people will often give you a diatribe, a rant against zoning without getting into the real particulars of literally what is zoning. So Nolan Gray walks you through, this is what it literally is. It exists as a map that you can go look up in your particular city's government. There will be a very detailed map that breaks this down into hundreds or sometimes even thousands of different types of districts. And those districts will be divided in this particular way. These districts can be used for this. This is how the process goes. It's actually very detailed for how zoning maps are created, how they're maintained. The level of detail here describing what zoning actually is on a technical level is very, very high, and I think very useful, something you don't always get. It also does a good job talking about why this leads to affordability crises, why this harms us so much. Why is zoning having a negative effect? That can be economic reasons, that can be segregation reasons, that it is effective segregation in many senses, that it leads to sprawl. And then, of course, at the end, it has the policy recommendations. As any book does, it talks about how can we make zoning less bad. Number one, if we're just going to reduce the harm of zoning, what can we do? Talks a lot about the Japanese system. It talks about getting rid of some levels of local control. It also ends the book with a case for abolishing zoning entirely, which is a pretty radical case, just to get rid of it 100%, all the way. Nolan admits that this is not something that is realistic in any reasonable timeline, but that it would be a good idea, according to him, if we could do it. He will take the gradual reform and the less bad version of zoning, but what Nolan Gray really wants is to abolish it. Very interesting book. I would compare it with Fixer Upper, which I mentioned earlier in the episode. They're both good books. If I could only recommend one, I probably would recommend Arbitrary Lines. It's a close thing because I enjoyed both of them. And I'll be honest, I read Arbitrary Lines more recently, so it might just be the case that Arbitrary Lines is more stuck in my head because I read it fairly recently and Fixer Upper was, many, many months ago. But I think Arbitrary Lines is just a little bit more interesting for me. It just dives a little bit more deeply into the history of zoning itself, which I think is the main culprit here. Strong recommendation for the book Arbitrary Lines by M. Nolan Gray. And now we get to the top 4 books that I have read so far this year in 2022. This includes 2 nonfiction works and 2 fiction works. We'll begin with number 4, which is The Power Law by Sebastian Mallaby. The Power Law is about the history of venture capital. It's called The Power Law, Venture Capital and the Making of the New Future. I will say that I typically do not like business books. I love to read about economics, but I don't enjoy reading business books, certainly not business books that are advice books like How to Run a Good Business. I typically despise those books. I typically also don't like books that are a history of a company or a biography of a specific businessman. I tend to think that those are just not very strong books, almost always, which I hope gives this a little bit more weight when I say how much I enjoyed this book. This book is kind of a history of venture capital and of Silicon Valley in general, at least the venture capital parts of it. And it focuses a lot on businessmen and business stories and the strategies that they used and how this industry developed. And despite me not liking this genre of book most of the time, I really enjoyed The Power Law. It starts at what it believes is the very beginning of this whole thing, when there are 8 kind of researchers working for a famous Nobel laureate engineer named William Shockley, who decide they don't want to work for him anymore, and they go found their own firm. They were called the Traitorous Eight, and it's a very dramatic name. And they helped found Fairchild Semiconductor with what was called $1.4 million of adventure capital. That's actually a fun fact I didn't know. The whole phrase venture capital, VC, comes from the original phrase, which was adventure capital, because you were literally going on an adventure. It was so risky to invest in this kind of thing. The book has an admirable amount of balance between telling the story of why venture capital is so necessary and so valuable, and how much venture capital has been able to lead to the technology boom that America has. It really is not an accident that all the best technology companies in the world have basically grown up in Silicon Valley, where venture capital is headquartered. There's a symbiotic relationship there where venture capital would not be what it is without the tech industry, but the tech industry could not have gotten to where it is without the growth that it was able to achieve through venture capital. Venture capital funding has made so much of this possible, and it talks about so many of the success stories, whether that's Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Apple, some of these very, very famous companies that were made possible by venture capital. It gets very much into the weeds, into the personal details of this deal literally hinged on one person. This company ended up succeeding, this venture capital firm, because one of their people showed up at Apple headquarters with a toothbrush and toothpaste and said, "I am determined to sit in this lobby forever until you give me a meeting and let me invest in your company." And they were so impressed by that they actually let him do it. And this person ended up making 100x on his investment because of how much Apple grew. There's a ton of crazy stories like that. The stories here are wild and crazy, as you would expect in a tumultuous industry like VC. But I respect the balance because it also talks about some of the flops and some of the ways in which this industry has gone overboard. There are ways in which the entire thing got caught up in itself. It got high on its own supply, in a sense. And it allowed people like Adam Newman at WeWorks to just spend ridiculous amounts of money with a business plan that was obviously always going to fail. It talks about the bad behavior of founders like Adam Newman and Travis Kalanick, who founded Uber and led to misogynistic and hostile workplaces, and how some of those places ended up having to kick out their original owners, and the mistakes that were made along the way. It is fairly honest in talking about the great successes and some of the busts and the failures and some of the issues that plague the industries that we're talking about. Overall, the quality of the writing is very high. I was addicted. I didn't put it down. I read it almost in, just a few days, despite it being a very thick book. I really enjoyed it. It was a really interesting history. And I think if you're interested in why, not just the stories themselves about how this all happened and which people were involved at which time, that's really interesting. But if you're also interested in a case for why venture capital matters, I think that this is a great book. The Power Law by Sebastian Mallaby. Number 3 in this episode's list is The Sandman by Neil Gaiman. The Sandman is not an individual book. The Sandman is a series of comics published by DC Comics, written by Neil Gaiman over the course of several years, and it follows a particular character named Dream. This, I believe, is one of the best graphic novels or comic series of all time. It is written by Neil Gaiman, and so the quality of writing is substantially higher than almost any other comic series that I've ever had the pleasure to read. It's just a really, really awesome book. One of the things that I prize the most in science fiction and fantasy is a world that you can really fully imagine, that's fully realized, and you can daydream about other things that would be happening in this world. It's just a very complete thing, a very interesting setting to have stories in. And usually the world will have some interesting feature. It's not just the current world, it's the current world plus this new feature that makes it exciting and new. The Sandman is about a world where there are 7 beings who are called the Endless. They are personifications of certain ideas, and they outlast even the gods themselves. In this world, gods are real, including the Greek gods, the Egyptian gods, all sorts of gods. And gods can wax and wane with time, maybe more powerful, less powerful. Some gods can even die with enough time. But the 7 Endless are forever. They are personifications of ideas. One of the Endless is Dream, who is known as Morpheus and a bunch of other names. There are other Endless such as Destiny, Death, Despair, Desire, Delirium, and Destruction. And basically, this series of stories is a widely dispersed, interlinked set of stories that are all dealing with the character Dream and how he interacts with the world, how Dream influences the world, and it's hard to do justice to exactly how sprawling and sweeping and majestic some of the storytelling is, but it's an absolutely astoundingly good set of comics. Again, I think it's the high enough quality that you'd almost have to call it like a graphic novel rather than a comic. Because again, when Neil Gaiman is involved, just good things happen. Neil Gaiman has written so much incredible work over the years. I had actually read this maybe a decade ago, but I reread it this year, and it was still very new and fresh to me because I had not seen it in such a long time. I read it because there is an actual TV series coming out based on The Sandman. I'm very excited for it, so I decided to reread the whole thing, the whole series. It was just as good as I remembered. if you enjoy kind of these highbrow comic books or these highbrow graphic novels, I would definitely recommend The Sandman. I think it's just incredibly creative, inventive storytelling about these endless and how they interact with humanity. And, some of the stories are set in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Some of them are set in terms of how dream inspired William Shakespeare to write A Midsummer Night's Dream. He was actually the one who gave him the inspiration there in exchange for certain other concessions. It's set during the French Revolution. It's set during the current day AIDS crisis. Current day in this case being late 80s and early 90s when this was written. And so, it's a sprawling narrative about these characters. I really enjoyed it. Strong recommendation. The Sandman by Neil Gaiman. Number 2 this year is a book named Cersei by Madeleine Miller. Cersei is a work of fiction, and I don't know if you would call it fantasy or science fiction, but it is certainly at least related to those, if you wouldn't put it there directly. Cersei is a demigod born into the house of Helios, who is the god of the sun. This is very much set among the classical pantheon, with Zeus and Helios and the Titans and all of kind of the Olympian gods. Cersei is a minor demigod here, and through some initial troubles in the book, she is banished to a deserted island where she kind of hones her power, hones her craft as a demigod, tames wild beasts, and ends up encountering some of the most famous characters from mythology, the Argonauts, the Minotaur. There's others I could go on, but basically these are stories that are set in Greek mythology, but the story really revolves around Cersei herself, this demigod who admittedly is not as powerful as almost any of the other main gods, but who straddles that line between being a god and being a mortal, and having to choose between connections to the mortal world and connections to the immortal world. And this is an incredibly well-written book. The quality of the prose is extraordinary, and I really, really loved it. Madeleine Miller has an incredible way with words. And it's one of the most emotional, humanizing books that I've read this year in terms of it's set in this very evocative landscape. As I said, I love being placed in a world that I can daydream about and having some fully realized world to think about that the characters live in. And that's all true, but beyond just having an interesting world, Cersei's inner life is so rich and so well described. Her emotions, her joy, her pain, her anguish, her indecision at certain moments, all of these things are so beautifully realized that I just couldn't help but love this book. I feel like it's a really well-accomplished book for doing what it's trying to do, which is to tell a story about, a woman alone on an island who has drawn the wrath of the gods and the wrath of men and is stuck between two worlds and ultimately has to make some very fateful decisions for herself and for the people she loves. Cersei, I can't say a whole lot more without, spoiling some of the key plot points of the book, but it is an absolutely great book. I really, really enjoyed it. A ton of literary quality. It's science fiction-esque or fantasy-esque in that it deals with the pantheon of gods, and it's kind of this created world. It's not our world, but it's written more much as kind of a normal literature style, I guess. It's not really written in a science fiction style. I would strongly recommend this. This is a 2 thumbs up review. Cersei by Madeleine Miller. And our final book that we will be reviewing, my favorite book that I read, probably the best book that I read in the first half of 2022, is Plagues Upon the Earth by Kyle Harper. The subtitle here is Plagues Upon the Earth, Disease and the Course of Human History. This is very much like a big history book about the sweep of civilization and human history as told through our diseases. And there's a really interesting way in which you can tell some of the pathways and the courses of human history through the diseases that we have. Humanity has always struggled with different kinds of diseases, whether they be parasites, viruses, bacterias, fungi. All of these have existed for a long time, but there are patterns to how they spread and patterns to how they have impacted human civilization. And I think Kyle Harper makes a really strong case that telling human history, teaching human history without teaching the course of these diseases is almost malpractice, because these diseases have been so incredibly influential throughout human history. There's some obvious cases like the Black Death in Europe, or the fact how Native American populations were wiped out when European colonizers came because of diseases that they had no defense for. But the book is good on so many levels, honestly. The book is appropriately scientific where it needs to be. It talks about microbiology, primatology. It's about evolution, and specifically about the evolutionary biology of viruses and bacteria. It talks about how these diseases can often swap between one species and another, or they use one species as a host species to infect another species, and the biology is very on point. You're never overwhelmed by the biology, but it's just enough and it is technical enough that you can understand everything that you need. It also talks about how human civilization changed disease at the same time that the diseases were changing human civilizations. There were a lot of ways in which these diseases really couldn't spread very effectively because humanity was just a bunch of hunter-gatherers at one point. And it wasn't until we built an ecosystem for these diseases that many of them could really spring into their fullness of existence, until we started packing people into very dense cities in kind of squalid conditions. Then is when we saw some of the most famous diseases begin to spring up. It's only after humans had spread rats to everywhere in the world via trade and urbanization and farming and things like that certain diseases also spread everywhere in the world. It talks about factors like urbanization and how that led to more disease spread and newer diseases that we didn't even realize were out there. It talks about how jails and hospitals and very crowded environments contributed to this. It talks about how military conflict was often a great driver of the spread of plagues and diseases. And then as it talks about how the urbanized world and the connected world led to larger pandemics than we had ever seen before in human history, it talks about the fight that humans began to make to restrict some of these diseases, whether that was through public health measures and public sanitation, whether it was through vaccination. Just overall, an incredibly impressive book that covers a gigantic, sweeping stretch of history. It covers the biology. It covers the civilizational aspects. It's very, very good at everything it does. It's incredibly well written. It's entertaining and captivating the entire time. It talks both about how diseases changed human civilizations and the course of history, and again, how our civilizations changed the course of evolutionary biology. The way we lived led to certain evolutionary pressures for diseases that they adapted to, which we then had to adapt to that disease, and then they adapted to us. And this is an incredible cycle that has been going on through all of human history. I really cannot recommend this enough. I thought the book was phenomenal. 2 thumbs up for Plagues Upon the Earth by Kyle Harper. And with that, we will close the episode. We have reviewed 17 books here. It included nonfiction and fiction, good books and bad books, and some phenomenal books. I hope you enjoyed the episode. At the end of the year, we will recap the entire year of 2022. We do this about every 6 months. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll catch you next time.